Here we are, CRF suspension part 3, where we actually get to ride the thing. Let's freaking go. Already I can feel such a difference. It's hard to describe, but it just feels like it's actually working. I'll be honest, I was afraid it was gonna feel too soft, but it just feels planted. The only thing that I've done as far as clickers is just put it to the recommended factory settings just to get a baseline, and we'll play around with those a little bit later on. We're gonna do dive, hard braking. Wow, it's funny just thinking conceptually in my head that with a softer spring, it would dive more, even though that's more rated for my body weight and my riding style, but it's actually not the case. I feel like it was diving a lot more with the factory suspension with the stiffer spring. And I think the reason why, now that I'm thinking about it, is because it was so stiff that when I would brake really hard, the momentum or whatever it is wasn't really pushing it down all the way, and then it would just kind of give, and then I would finally get the spring action. But this one, the spring action feels a lot more fluid, like it's throughout the entire length of the entire travel of the fork. I wish I could compare the two, and I guess I can show you some before and afters right here of hard braking to a complete stop. And I don't know how much of an impact you can see between before and after, but as far as a feeling goes, I think the best way to describe it honestly is it just feels so fluid. Wow, there's no harshness with that impact. That feels so good. Not soft, but just intentional. I'll show some before and after of this little impact too. I don't know if that's gonna show up or not, but again, feeling wise, it's so fluid. I feel like the other one previously was so stiff that it felt like it was bottoming out when I know it wasn't. No way. I mean, I was only using like maybe 3/4 of my full suspension travel, so there's no way it was bottoming out. Hey there, future me interrupting my past self really quickly because I want to highlight this even more. If you saw my install video, which I hope you have, but if not, here's a still of that, and you can see with the dust exactly how little travel I was using. After I did the install, I wanted to see how much of an impact this had with some of the riding that you're seeing right now, plus a lot more testing that you'll see in this video with a zip tie on this portion of the fork leg, and as you can see, it's all the way down here now. Big difference right here. Anyway, back to the riding. I know suspension is tricky, but it's one of those things that once you do it and you get it to your preference or dialed in, oh, it just transforms the bike, turns it into a handling machine. So changing the spring rate in the front got us like 95% of the way there to perfect suspension, and I confirmed that by rechecking the sag as we did in the first episode of this series. We checked the static sag and the free sag with the front, and now it's sitting at 58 millimeters of static sag and 29 millimeters of free sag. And if you recall, we also compared that to the general recommended settings within Racetech's Motorcycle Suspension Bible, and yes, if you look at the two now, it's sitting a little bit lower than it should be, but again, these are general recommended settings across dirt bikes for the entire range and shouldn't be really treated as gospel. Point is, it feels so much better than it used to be, and now I feel like I'm actually using the full spring rate, not just bouncing on top of it. However, we still have that final 5% to make it just perfect, and that is going to be in our clicker adjustment settings. So compression and rebound, which I touched on in the first video of this series, have soft and hard adjustments to help fine-tune the suspension and determine how quickly or slowly the suspension compresses and then rebounds. Now it's actually determining what these clicker settings are going to be for both myself and you watching is a whole nother story, because unfortunately there is not a tried and true method that says exactly how many clicks out you need to be for all of your compression and rebound front and rear. It's just not that simple. It's much more of a feeling. And on top of that, it's even harder to show a feeling visually as a presenter to you watching this video. But let's do a side by side, as you can see right here, of the absolute softest and absolute hardest settings. You can actually see the front forks moving as opposed to the bottom with the hardest settings where it barely moves at all. It's actually really stiff. Putting even more weight into the bounce test, you can see just how much movement and how quickly the softest setting goes. The hardest setting, you have to push it to actually get it to have any movement, any give. We do of course have Racetech's Motorcycle Suspension Bible, which we've been referencing this entire series, but again, what they say in there is ultimately a feeling.
feeling. Bottom line, and I'll quote, "It's not about right or wrong, it's just personal preference and what will make that rider the fastest they can be."
However, the Motorcycle Suspension Bible does provide some good guidance in the form of visuals. As you can see here, it's an ideal scenario showing that we want no movement on the chassis against the horizon at all, no matter what the terrain. The suspension is going to take care of everything for us. However, that's in a perfect world. We don't live in a perfect world, so we want to get as close to that as possible and minimize all of the movements that we see on the chassis in any kind of particularly bumpy or rocky terrain. So to test this, the Bible recommends a stretch of road or dirt that has a healthy number of different bumps and sizes with roundness and sharpness. So no better way to test that, at least for a street setup, than a school parking lot. So right here I have a series of speed bumps. As you can see right there, there's several more behind me, and I'm going to go over them at a certain speed. I think I'm going to first do the extreme scenarios that you saw previously, the softest and the hardest settings, to kind of calibrate myself, make sure I'm familiar with the most extreme scenarios, and then I'm going to kind of bracket it from there, kind of move in big chunks until I don't feel like it's making much of an improvement, go back and kind of whittle my way down into the middle where my ideal clicker scenario is.
And here's the extremes, and the funny thing is they look really similar. This is because in these extremes the bike is getting launched off the speed bump, but for two different reasons. The hardest setting is hitting it like a bicycle with a rigid frame and bouncing off the give in the tire, while the softest is kind of springboarding you. This is also why getting it dialed in is tricky, because both of these can feel similarly harsh, but writing the extremes between the two really helps. You can see this even more in these sharper bumps. The chassis is constantly rocking back and forth, and while it seems like it's rocking less with the harder settings, if you look at the fender bag in the back, you can see just how much harsher it is. I actually had to refit the plastics after this test. It's a subtle difference, but you can see in this scenario, the softer setting is just doing a much better job of absorbing the impact. Although it's still being a bit of a pogo stick, it just goes to show why in general you want softer settings for rougher, slow terrain like single track or enduro.
So you'd think with that in mind that I would be going for something a little bit harder because of my Supermoto setup, but that's actually not the case. I've been testing this not just in a parking lot for the last week or so, getting my settings dialed in after looking at those extremes, fine-tuning it, and I think I found my perfect setup, and it's actually, surprisingly, softer pretty much across the board. So I'll put up on the screen now the stock settings, what is recommended to start with, my final settings, and the difference. And you can see for the most part it's softer all the way around. Front is most definitely softer in compression and rebound. I was actually surprised by that. I thought I was going to be a little harder in the front because I have a softer spring, but turns out it just needed to be softer overall. Then in the rear it's actually a little bit different, because in the rebound it's softer, but in the compression, both the high and the low speed, it's harder. I'm not exactly sure why I landed on that, but it just feels much better. My only guess is that maybe because the spring rate calculator said I should have a slightly stiffer spring than stock, only about half a kilogram per millimeter, but still, maybe it's just compensating for that. I just feel like with it being a little bit harder in the rear, I'm not getting as springboarded when I go over bumps like these. And I gotta tell you, now that I've gotten it to my final settings, it is so dialed, especially over things like these big rolling speed bumps. Oh, one right after the other, it just feels like the tires, they're always in contact with the gravel. It's awesome. I gotta say, I love the way this thing handles now. It is so dialed, and I'm so happy that I actually took the time and effort to change the suspension, because if I'm honest, I was a little intimidated by it. And if I'm honest again, all the dual sports and dirt bikes that I've had in the past, I've never messed with their suspension. However I bought it, those were the settings, and I just left it at that. But if you have any issues or you feel uncomfortable on your bike, if it's feeling too harsh or too twitchy or anything like that, and you haven't dialed in the suspension, I highly recommend looking into it, because suspension can transform a bike. It can really, really make that deciding factor with the handling and really gain your confidence too in riding it. So I hope that this was helpful. This is the final episode in a 3-part series to do with the suspension of this bike. Previously, we checked the settings, we changed some things, and finally today dialed it in. So if you haven't seen those 2 videos, I highly recommend doing so. I will put them on the end screen over here, as well as link it in the description below. If you like this kind of stuff, you like the CRF and anything to do with it, or have any questions on it, any modifications, I've done a lot to this and I plan on doing a lot more to it. So follow along, and see you next time.